Good afternoon, everyone, on a beautiful, if cold, November day. I think what we're going to talk about today is one of the most important things, one of the most important questions we have to answer in society today. How are we going to continue to grow as a society, but do so in a sustainable way? Okay, this is a fundamental question we're all going to have to face into, particularly you as you start your careers, if we're going to move forward in society. So today I'm going to talk about value creation through circularity, through the business that I've built that is focused on the circular economy. And we're going to get right into the business aspects of that. How do you start a business, build a business, the value propositions, and some specific subjects which you'll be leaning to right now when you're looking at your business planning process. Now, my part of business, the sector I work in, is IT. My job is trying to make technology more sustainable. So to help you step into that world and think about why that's important, I've got a short video.
That would use things rather than use them up. We could build a future that really could work in the long term.
There is no escaping the overwhelming evidence that we are destroying our planet at a breathtaking speed and at a breathtaking scope. So, is there a way to change direction? To rethink the economic model? I think the answer is yes.
I think that's the best bass I've ever had playing that video. So fantastic job, University of York. Definitely felt that one coming through. So just a little bit more about my organisation. So we're a small group of companies that started about 18 years ago. I think it's fair to say, 18 years ago, as a society, we weren't worrying about sustainability as much as we do today. We weren't as clear of the challenges and the problems. There wasn't the urgency that we see. But we've got 18 years experience of actually helping organizations implement technology in more sustainable ways. To do that, we feel like we have to be validated. We have to feel we've been tested by external third parties. So we use an organization called EcoVadis, who rates companies around the globe on how sustainable they are. And we were rated in the top 1% of companies worldwide. Now, that obviously sounds great, and I'm proud of that, but it's fair to say that bar could be higher. You know, a lot of organizations aren't really pushing themselves as hard and fast as they could to become more sustainable. Simply put, we do two things. We help organizations with the thinking about how to be more sustainable with the use of technology, but we also help them with the doing. We actually implement networks and IT solutions in ways that are more sustainable. We started here in the UK, we expanded across Europe, the United States, and we also deliver services to customers in Asia. But I want to bring this home a little bit. Let me, because you guys are going to be entrepreneurs. You guys are going to go out there and actually build businesses yourselves. And what's useful there, you might have heard the expression, an origin story, a reason why you do what you do. My origin story starts quite young, when I even had hair colour. So that football-shaped head is mine as a young boy, and around the time when home computers were just becoming a thing. Nearly all of you have laptops in front of you today, but that wasn't always the case. When I was a child, my family couldn't afford to buy me my own home computer. Now, that's not a sad story, but it's a reality. And for me, what I realise is we have a really weird relationship with technology. As soon as it's a bit old, as soon as it's a bit out of date, we throw or give it away. But that actually, for me, was an opportunity, because I was able to build my own home computer out of bits and parts that other people were willing to give or throw away. Now, I don't mean I have the soldering iron out and actually soldered in microprocessors and things like that. I was just simply slotting in cards into a motherboard and plugging the whole thing together. But the point is still valid. You know, the way we use technology and the way we use a lot of things in society is massively wasteful. But fast forward this on a bit, when I was at university, I was inspired by that journey, so I went and studied computer science. And I studied computer science at the time just as the internet boom was growing. Now, the internet boom, if you've thought or read about it, is actually very similar to what we're seeing today with AI. There's this great promise of technology, how it was going to change our lives. But what quite often happens during these times of boom is, again, we're extremely wasteful. We're throwing out the old, we're bringing in the new. We're not always thoughtful about how we do that in sustainable ways. So I graduated university and it was easy for me to get a job. Unfortunately, that might not be your experience. I dropped straight into startups. I worked with other people who had business ideas, and I got to see firsthand how businesses were built. Some good, some bad. But I realized I didn't really understand business. I understood technology a bit, but I didn't really understand business. So I took myself off to business school. I studied in Madrid to learn about how business works. And when I came back to the UK, I joined a telecommunications company, what you kind of call heavy tech. You know, these are big networks, cable systems that run under the sea, but they enable other companies to consume technology. And again, I saw how wasteful we are when it comes to technology. That technology refresh cycles mean every 3 or 5 years, we take all that technology out, we throw it away. Now, we live on a planet of finite resources, like it said in the video. We're living on a planet we've got to really worry about emissions. Can we really afford to keep ripping these things up, this technology up, that's still working, still fine, and just throwing it away? And that's when a sort of light blinked on in my mind, and I thought back to that child, of like, there's a different way here. And coincidentally, at the same time, a large technology vendor just started remanufacturing its own technology. So taking its product back from the market, remanufacturing their technology to the same condition as new, and providing it back into the market with the same warranties, the same guarantee, the same software licenses. Now, that sounds obviously like, well, that sounds like a great business idea. But none of their existing customers and suppliers thought this was a great idea. None of them leapt at the opportunity to start a business purely focused on it. So that's what I did. Now, it's a pretty simple business model. You're taking a product from someone and selling it to somebody else. It was attractive because I could understand the cost base and I could see the opportunity. It was 2009, which was a financial recession. These products were cheaper, so I thought they'd be really attractive to customers. But perhaps naively at the time, this is 2009, I thought people would care more about the sustainability. I thought people would care because it was better for the environment, like less waste. Sure, this is a good thing. We'd all embrace that, right? As we'll come to a bit later, no, the key was the commercial element. We could achieve the social good, the more sustainable outcome, but actually what mattered to the businesses for the decision was really the money. Now, fast forward that on, as I said, we've expanded internationally, we've had success in just about every industry, but it's really only the last 4 or 5 years where we've been able to dial up the sustainability side of what we do, and we now have customers that come to us because we're more sustainable, not just because we're more commercially attractive. Now, I spend quite a lot of time like this sharing the story, talking about it. And as you all know, in the modern world, actually, so much of what we do has to be commented upon. You need to be present on social media. You need to be getting that message out there. You need to be heard. But that didn't come naturally to me. I thought if we just did the right things in the right way and looked after customers, people would know who we are. That we would be successful just by deems of doing the right thing. But increasingly, that's not the way the world works, right? But it's helpful when, as we had this year, you win awards. That can feel great. You can get a lot of attention for that kind of stuff. But success isn't a linear journey, which is another thing that we'll talk about today. So that's a little bit of my story. But let's talk a bit more about where do you create value? How, when you guys are thinking about building businesses, and particularly sustainable businesses, where is the value? How do you show that there is profit to be made, there is value to be created? And particularly, I want to start with thinking about the customer. If you're going to start a business, the most fundamental question you have to answer is the value proposition for that customer. It's not about the value proposition for you. You can have that in the back of your mind, building your business, creating wealth for you, but it's got to start with fundamentally delivering something of sufficient value to the customer. So when we talk about sustainability and we talk about offerings to customers, as I've said already, but I'm going to emphasize this several times, it's got to start with saving the customer money or creating some meaningful financial benefit for the customer. You're not going to find many people that are going to buy what you're offering just because it's more sustainable. It's going to have to deliver other values. So for me, in technology terms, if we're providing a technology solution, it's got to be fit for purpose. It's got to deliver the need that the customer wants. It's got to be competitively priced. And then sustainability can be a differentiator. Then it can be a benefit people get excited about. But if we don't deliver on the first two parts, we don't get in the door. It's not easy to win customers. And we'll get onto the forecasting bit. Everyone likes a nice straight line forecasting growth curve. You can forecast whatever you like, but fundamentally, the fight of your lives, the fight in starting a business is actually a fight to win over customers, to get them to believe in you and to want to spend the money. Right? So you need grit, you need determination, you need to find your way of selling. And if you want to be an entrepreneur, the number one skill is to be able to communicate, is to be able to help people understand what you offer, but more than anything is to listen and understand those needs of the customer and to be able to bend what your idea is to what they actually need, not the other way around. So, as I said, you've got to deliver value and deliver sustainability. In our world, one of the first things we saw as possible in sustainability terms is providing services that allow people to use what they already have for longer. And it's got examples of these in a minute, but think about that for a second. So most people, most product sales organizations say are driven by the next sale, the next product that they sell to the customer. So it's quite a different proposition to go out there and say, I'm not going to sell you another product. I'm going to offer you a service that allows you to use your products for longer. It's one of the number one things you can do to make ourselves more sustainable, to keep using what we already have for longer. The second thing is a mindset shift with customers, is to think when they have a new requirement for something, when they're building out a new building or doing something new, that what they need is more technology in my world. But they automatically think it must be new. It must be bright, new, shiny, out of the box. But actually, some of the great stuff we can do is use things that already exist, remanufacture, refurbish things. Now, in our lives, we're pretty comfortable with this. Most of us live in renovated homes. We drive second-hand cars. Probably a lot of the tech that you buy, you might buy second-hand. But when you go into the corporate world, when you go out into business and big organizations, everything's always new. It's always bought new. So there's an opportunity there to sell something different, and that's what we do. And finally, there's value in what people have decided they no longer need, which is literally they're never going to use again, they no longer need it. There is value in those resources, in those assets. As you can see, it all forms part of the circular economy. So whether they can redeploy it elsewhere internally, whether they can sell that asset and get the value for it, or maybe even donate it, that's still value. So here's just some examples of how the customer business case works, how you can demonstrate value in sustainability, but also commercial value. But let me make these more tangible to you. So real world, real projects. So this is the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier. One of only 2 aircraft carriers this country has produced in the last 15 odd years. That aircraft carrier had about 7 data centers on it. Remember, we're in tech, right? 7 data centers worth of technology. It took 6 or 7 years to build that aircraft carrier, and by the time it was ready to go to sea trials, like actually get used, the technology company that sold them that product said, that technology's end of sale now, you're going to have to rip it all out and replace it. I mean, you might imagine that wasn't particularly well received. So what did we do? Well, we showed the MOD how they could extend what they had. We showed them how they could spare the products that they had, how they could extend the capacity. But the fundamental value exchange there was extending the life, not having to replace that technology. We saved them £15 million. We generated £1 million for ourselves. Very disruptive. Most of the other technology providers were jumping there thinking, I've got a £15 million deal there. And we showed the MOD they didn't need to do that. Now, that's the financial side, but there were tons of equipment on this aircraft carrier. Huge amounts of embodied carbon in that equipment. And it would have been a huge amount of waste if they had to rip and replace that. So that's a business model that fundamentally drove value for us and the customer through extended life. Remanufactured technology. People sometimes talk about refurbished or used equipment. There's a whole spectrum of non-new things out there. Remanufactured is as close as you like to new equipment. So this is that vendor that we talked about. It's a vendor called Cisco, who are fully remanufacturing devices. We work with a large telecommunication company, and we've now seamlessly integrated new and remanufactured products into their supply chain. And by default, if it's available, they take the remanufactured one. Every day this decision is made. Like, we need 50 routers over here, another 20 routers over here for a customer. And every time we try and maximize the amount of remanufactured equipment for them. Why is that so good? Well, first of all, much less carbon. What it takes to remanufacture a device is much less than what it takes to build a device new. Think about that. We extract metals and minerals out of the ground, we refine them, then we go through a massive, complicated manufacturing process, and then we ship goods around the world. That's the new model. Remanufacturing, you're simply taking it back from where it was, replacing any worn parts, testing it, and making sure it's fit for purpose. Much lower embodied carbon footprint, and you retain like sort of 90% of the original materials. So much smaller carbon footprint. And since like 2020, what we've done with carbon, we've saved more than 2,000 tons of embodied carbon. Just by that one decision to take remanufactured instead of new every day when they're deploying their solutions. So it's not just the carbon savings. Again, we save them about $1 million a year in terms of cost. And that's how we started. We started them because we helped them save money. But now they're very proud of their sustainability credentials. They're board and they have public-facing reports that talk about the sustainability credentials. One always comes with the other. Talked about the value of resale. I think a lot of people underestimate the value of the assets they already have. So we did a big project with Deutsche Bank, across New York, in fact, to help them remove the technology out of 7 data centers. They were hoping, we'll just get a little bit of money for this process. Obviously, it's being a bank, they're really worried about data, so we had to do a lot of data destruction work. We made sure they deleted data on site, and then we took it away and destroyed the data again. But fundamentally, through this process, we helped them recover about £250,000 of assets. Real money, right? There's a business model right there, just in itself. But also, we protected all these materials that otherwise would have got scrapped. And the kicker, once again, being carbon. Now, when you're measuring carbon, you have to be a little bit careful. Obviously, Deutsche Bank had already bought these products. They had already, if you like, spent that carbon budget. But by making sure those products got reused, what we did is we prevented all the customers that bought this used equipment from buying brand new. So the alternative would have had a much higher carbon footprint. They'd have been building all those products new from scratch. So again, saving around 740 tons of carbon just by making sure something got reused. Can't always resell devices. In my business, we hold quite a lot of stock of products, and sometimes we don't get the profile right. Sometimes we're left holding stock that we don't need. Now, we could have just recycled that, but we worked a bit harder than that and found that we could donate that equipment to help rebuild schools in Ukraine. Obviously, a horrendous situation in Ukraine with the invasion from Russia. Schools have been destroyed. They don't have IT equipment. So whilst we couldn't sell this product, there was a value. And that value is not just to the schools. Of course, that's very important. There's an associated value in that decision, and there's a reflection of doing a good thing. My microphone's just popped off here. No, say I'm talking too much.
It wasn't me. I didn't deliberately cut you off. Let's switch to this one.
Okay, so let's switch that. Well, it's kind of working here now, bizarrely. You can hear me all right at the back? Nodding heads.
Sorry to interrupt
good
you,
thumbs
full
up there,
flow.
very clear. If I cut off again, let me know. Let's change gears a little bit, right? So social value is important. There's lots of different types of value you can create through circular models, right? But when we talk about the circular economy, we're not just talking about the customer. In the circular economy, essentially you're folding that linear economy, that take it out of the ground, make something, use it, throw it away, and you're folding it on itself into a circle, right? That's the visual metaphor. But what that means is, what once was a customer can become a supplier can be a customer. What you're trying to do is retain the value as much as possible. So the business case is very similar looking upstream into your suppliers in a circular economy. Okay, the business case still holds true. Now, there's an opportunity for the supplier to create greater profitability in non-new technology than it is in brand new technology. And again, measurably more sustainable. You know, remanufacturing is simply more cost effective for all the reasons you might expect. Less need for materials, less manufacturing process, etc. That same argument about reduced CO2 can equally be used by a supplier to talk about how much more sustainable their product is. And one of the kickers here, and we'll come back to this a bit later when we're talking about how you value a business, but resilience is becoming a bigger and bigger topic in sustainability. There's an increased awareness that we live in a world with finite materials, that the things that we're currently building things out of aren't going to be available forever. There isn't an unlimited supply of metals and materials. So if you want a long-term business, long-term value, you've got to be thinking about your supply chain. You've got to be thinking about how you can have access to these materials as we compete for them. So I said, using this case study from Cisco, their remanufactured product they call Cisco Refresh, right? That's their brand. And it ticks all these boxes. It's 10 to 30% more profitable than their new product. Sounds great. They use that profit to provide financing models to create bigger and bigger deals. It boosts their sustainability credentials, right? Even though in relative terms to their new business, it's quite small. This all sounds fantastic, right? But there are limitations and there are barriers. A lot of their teams in their organization don't really know about it, don't understand it. They don't invest in it in the same way they invest in their new product. Their sales teams aren't actually incentivized to sell it. And if you're selling it at a lower cost, that is making the job of the salesperson harder because they've got revenue targets to hit. And overall, there's this fear, if we sell too much of this remanufactured, is it going to hit our new sales, right? So it's not a perfect world. But when you reflect on that, I've talked very specifically about the IT industry, but think about the same thing for any kind of product or service-based business. And when I think about my business and the journey I've been on, there's some real learnings that I would like to share with you for you to consider in your process when you're thinking about planning. And planning. So planning can mean a lot of things, right? You can be planning from scratch. If you're starting a business from scratch, you're building that business plan, that's one view. But every business goes through planning cycles. Right now, this is exactly my planning window for next year. So myself and my leadership team are thinking about what opportunities are we going to go after for next year. Where do we think we're going to grow and establish ourselves? Now, the role of a CEO, but the role of any entrepreneur, is to have your head up and be looking out into society. It's about looking at what's going on, what changes are happening, or what changes can I initiate to create a value proposition. So you need to be reading the news. You need to be knowing what's going on in society if you're going to do effective planning. Right? I've got an analogy for you. I don't know how many of you play poker or at least know of the game of poker. Right? If you want to earn money in poker, it is more important to pick a good table to play at than it is to be a great poker player. Some tables have good money on them. People are willing to bet. Maybe they're people that don't have great skill sets, but there's money flowing. And there are other tables where everyone's really careful about the money. They're not going to place the bets. In business terms, you need to be picking the table where there is money, where there is growth, where there is market opportunity. If you find a market where there's good opportunity, you can get good at that market. If you invest the time and the energy and you're smart, you can get good at playing poker at that table. If you put all your energy in just being really good at playing poker, but you pick the wrong table, your opportunities are going to be limited. So when you're working with your teams, you've got to be asking yourself that question. How good a table is this? How good is that opportunity? Everything in business comes down to some kind of business case, like the basic maths. We put this much effort in, we spend this much money, what are we going to get out of it? Okay, so you've got to get really comfortable in that, but you've also got to be adding other variables. So not just, I think the sales is going to be great, we'll keep the cost low, we're all good, right? It's like you've got to be thinking about success and how do you measure and anticipate the likelihood of being successful. That's got to come into your planning process. Now, when people talk about planning, sometimes they just think, I just need a great idea. I think it's so much more about execution. Yes, you've got to have a good target market, but some of it comes down to execution. And the plan itself has got to be quite detailed. It's got to have the how in it. It's got to have a timeline, and crucially, it's got to have accountability. You and each of your team have to take responsibility for parts of that plan. It sounds obvious, but so many business plans fail because they have a cracking idea. The numbers look wonderful, but the execution's pretty poor. There isn't good accountability. They haven't thought through the actual plan. Now, one of your biggest assets as an entrepreneur and as a small business is being flexible. You might have heard the terminology of a pivot. Has anyone heard the terminology of a pivot? You know, like being willing to change the idea. Don't become a hostage to the idea, the initial concept. Even though it might feel like your baby, you're super passionate about it, you've got to be ready to adapt and adapt aggressively. Actually, it's your secret weapon. Because bigger companies, you might have thought you're a competition, can't adapt so fast. So think about that. Forecasting. I did say, every forecast that you'll ever see nearly always has that sort of bluey-green line. Oh, sales are just going to go that way. Right? Always a sales forecast. And there's nothing wrong with a positive sales forecast, but you've got to think carefully about how are you using those numbers. The reality is much more likely to be like the orange line. It's certainly true in my business. Over the years I've grown, but it's not been a straight line. So how do you think about that? How do you reflect that? And how do you make sure that that journey remains relative to your cost curve? As I said, I think you need to think about having the different lines and what lines you draw. So a budget is very different than a forecast. A budget is what you use to make sure you can afford to do what you want to do. And separate that from maybe your sales forecast. Or even in your sales forecast, maybe you have a budgetary line. The more conservative, I'm very certain we can at least get here. But you also have your aggressive, I'm excited, going to pitch this one to the investors line of your sales growth, right? But budget conservatively, but have a plan. Your plan tries to get you to that top of the growth curve, but your budget keeps you safe. Yeah, be careful with sales numbers. Anyone can write a sales number. Everyone can say, oh, well, last week we did this, therefore next week it's going to grow. It's just not the reality. No business has a straight line sales curve. Never. You do generally, and you should, have an extremely good handle on costs, and had an extremely good handle on actual cash flow. Yeah, anyone heard the expression, revenue is vanity, profit is sanity, cash is king? Certainly a good way of thinking about business planning it when you're an entrepreneur, right? Cash is king. And as I said, you're always managing that cash, you're always managing your cost, but the actual cash you've got in the bank under that conservative budget line. Okay, that's how we plan, and that's kept us safe through things like COVID, Brexit, and all sorts of disruption, right? Having that clear view of what you can afford to do. And this is super, super important if you're playing with your own money, right? I don't know how many of you as entrepreneurs are going to try and bootstrap it, do it off your own back. Obviously, if you're backed by a P firm or a VC, they'll probably push you harder on the growth curve. Okay? As long as they understand the risk, that's their money, that you can move harder and faster. But if it's your own money, obviously be smart about it. Right, teaming collaboration. Possibly one of the most important aspects of starting and running a business is the people in it. And I visited business school, and I've been coached on this, but still when I started my business, I didn't do enough due diligence on my original partner. I ended up with someone who I really didn't like, I didn't respect, and fundamentally had different values to me. Yeah, that's my bad. But don't make my mistake, right? You can't always pick who's in your team, but you can pick how you work with them and how you cooperate. There's a famous saying of, I think it's an African proverb, it's like, if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I'm guessing most of you would like your businesses to go far. Okay, so you have to invest. None of us are perfect. It might be your idea, but you've got to let those things go. You've got to work out how you're going to get there together. I think the most important place to start, and again, I didn't do this properly with my partner, is really sit down and align goals, right? Where do you want to get to? But I would argue, also add to this list, values, how you want to get there, what matters. You know, are you going to be a ruthless business that will stomp on anyone to get there? Or is there a certain way that you actually want to work together, certain principles you want to work to? Agree the guidelines. And this sounds like you're over-enunciating. Surely you just go, right, and you work out as you go. No, I think you have to pause at this moment and be aligned before you start. Set some guidelines of how you're going to operate. Where are your boundaries? I was talking to Claire earlier, actually. I set a boundary really early on. I didn't want to be working more than, on a typical week, more than 50 hours a week. Not very entrepreneurial. Surely I should be smashing 100, 150 hours a week, right? But I felt if I had to work much more than that, something was wrong with the model. And that was me. That was my own guidelines. That was my own principles. But it helped guide me. Those guiding principles still guide me today and how I run my business. This is always a tricky one. There's always tension in a team of who's really doing the work. I bet if you're already working in teams, you're already feeling that a little bit. Are the people doing as much as me? I'm carrying all the work here. Who's contributing? But rather than create distance in that and get frustrated, if people aren't contributing, find out why. Quite often it's because you're not aligned. Quite often it's because they weren't brought in enough in the first place, or they don't understand, or they don't know how they can contribute. So you've got to spend energy and time thinking about that. And also try and find a way to actually use people's strengths. We're not all good at the Excel spreadsheet. We're not all good at the creative marketing. How do you use those skills that you have? Find those skills that your teammates do have. Help them make the most of those. Again, sounds simple, but like in any relationship, so much of it is based on open, consistent communication. Not aggressive, why didn't you do this? You need to have accountability. But support, encouragement, but regular engagement. Even over talking about things at the beginning might feel a bit awkward. Why are we still talking about this? But until everyone's lined up, everyone's bought in, everyone understands what they have to do, you can't go fast anywhere. You can't start running off in the direction. Get alignment, get together, get some trust, confidence, understanding of each other, what matters to each other. Once you're there, you can travel fast. You can really get stuff done. But most people just start running, and they don't pay attention to this stuff at the beginning. Now, I know you guys, most of you are studying business, so this is a pretty basic equation, but I want to dip into parts of it for you and talk specifically about sustainability. So, most organizations are driven by creating value, creating valuation for the business. Right? That is the sort of simple definition of creating a business. Now, social entrepreneurship is slightly different. There's other value trying to create. But the financial principles here are key, because if you're going to get any kind of investment, this is the equation that are in people's minds. Some kind of profit metric times a multiple. Right? What you're actually selling, take away the costs, times some kind of multiple. Now, in sustainability, you have some advantages, and you need to be confident about talking about this when you're talking about valuation. So the uniqueness in sustainability sometimes comes down to differentiation. You say, look, we're bringing a product to market, it's more sustainable than the rest, therefore we're going to have a better win rate. Therefore we're going to create more sales. Okay? You might be able to offer unique services, like the services we had to extend product life. No one else is offering that. That drives sales. You might argue that through your brand, through what you're doing, that there's a chance to differentiate that will create more profitability. So not just winning the sale, but you can actually charge a premium. Maybe. There aren't many products creating a lot of a premium at the moment in sustainability, but it is possible. The more obvious place people start is on the cost side. As I said, remanufactured equipment, for example, lower costs. Therefore, you can create more value. Equally, all organizations can cut costs if they're more efficient, more sustainable, can lower service delivery costs, less energy consumption, things like that. Another key one in sustainability, you're looking at the brand. How are you going to position that brand? Not only from a differentiation point of view with customers, but how does it create uniqueness with suppliers? One of the companies we advise has now got unique supply contracts because they were the only one that led with sustainability. They were the only one that wanted to take remanufactured technology and take it to market. Uniqueness with supply is sometimes even more valuable than uniqueness with customers, because once you've locked down the supply, you're the only one that can deliver for customers. So brand's key. The harder part of this equation, and the one you might feel like you have less influence over, is the multiple side of the equation. But think about that for a minute. There's a really multiple. So say you make 2 million of net profit in your business. You change that multiple number, your valuation ramps up very, very, very fast. It's often, as I said, often the bit that gets neglected by entrepreneurs. We focus on just making money, but we don't think about the context and how we articulate our value proposition to investors, to others, around this multiple, and these other factors. And just very quickly, let me run you through some of them. So this first one goes back to that picking the right poker table, picking the right opportunity. If you want to have a successful business, particularly a fast-growing business that people want to invest in, you've got to be able to articulate why you are in a fast-growing, meaningful market. That growth potential is one of the key drivers on the multiple. And then can you continue to grow into new services and new markets? Growth potential is key. We've talked about financial performance on the net profit side, but that's just the profit you make. How does your financial performance compare to others in your field, in your sector? Are you more profitable? So for every pound put in, does more come out? Do you return a higher profitability for your revenue than your competition? Is your financial performance, are you better financially run than your competition? If you are, not only does it reflect in your net profit, it also reflects in your multiple. Probably a little bit less for you to influence, but you need to be able to articulate is what is going to happen in your industry. We would like to believe that all industries are going to trend towards becoming more sustainable. That may or may not be true. But if you can evidence that it is, you're in a stronger position. We touched on this a bit before. One of the big things we're going to see in society is disruption to supply chains. For all sorts of reasons. We've talked about finite materials, right? During COVID, there was disruption in the manufacturing of computer chips. Does anyone remember Chipageddon? It was in the news. Maybe not. But so Chipageddon, shortage of microprocessor chips. You're like, okay, so what? Well, everything, pretty much everything now has chips in it. It got so bad at some point that Volvo cars were buying fridges. Yeah, I'll let that sit for a second. Yeah, buying fridges because the fridges had the chips, the microprocessors they needed to build their cars. We're going to see much more disruption in supply chains. One, because of finite resources. We're literally competing for resources for things like copper. But equally, geopolitically. We've gone from quite a stable geopolitical environment to, let's face it, quite an unstable position. And that is going to continue to disrupt supply chains. So organizations that have resilient supply chains, that have alternative supply chains, perhaps remanufactured supply chains, or they can extend the life of their technologies, they are not limited to what comes down the supply chain, are going to be valued higher. And the final one I want to land on here is how you articulate your competitive advantage. Now, part of this comes back to the brand. If you can be disruptive and say, look, we're going to be the most sustainable brand in our industry, we can evidence our sustainability, we can show that we are credibly more sustainable than everyone else, that's a pretty good story from a brand point of view. But I think on the other side of the equation is there's a massive war on for talent, the best people. A lot of the tech businesses you see out there, their valuations are not driven as much by their profitability as by how many smart people they have in their organization. You've got to be thinking about talent even when you're thinking about the value of your organization. So, to sort of recap some of that, there are absolutely meaningful and exciting opportunities to create value through the circular economy. I've built a business purely based on that. And there's loads more opportunity out there. There's not a lot of people building these disruptive models. I can't overemphasize enough walking in the shoes, firstly, of your customers. Don't worry about your bank balance, worry about theirs. What are you doing to make their lives easier, to make them more financially profitable? But equally, look back upstream. Look at the suppliers. How can you do the same thing there? How can you help them and bring that circular economy together? But I think it is key also not to be limited by their ambitions. In my world, when I talked about Cisco in that refresh program, remanufactured product, their ambitions weren't that high. And if I was just stuck thinking about them and selling their product, my ambitions were limited too. You need to build something that is yours to scale, that you can control. No matter what part of entrepreneurship you're going into, and probably no matter what you want to do in your career, you need to get comfortable selling ideas. That could be selling a product, selling a service, but even if it's not, it's selling ideas. How are you going to convince people to come and work with you? You've got to sell them the idea. How are you going to convince someone to invest in you? You've got to sell them the idea. I spent the first 3 years of my business literally cold calling. Might not think that's super exciting, might not even want to do that job. Fundamentally, those skills I learned, I use today. I'm using them right now. So get comfortable selling, work on your determination and grit to keep going. As I said before, you can have a stellar, accelerated, astronomic hope for growth, but budget conservatively. Okay? You have a plan for growth, but you budget conservatively. Didn't talk too much about trusting your instincts, but people talk about instinct as gut or heart. Instincts really come from 75% of your brain. What we actually think with most of is 25% of our brain. Instincts use all the abstract information that you're sort of processing but don't realize it. As an entrepreneur, you've got to trust those instincts and act on them aggressively, particularly when you need to change. Got to invest in a good team. I don't just mean financially, you've got to invest the time. Get alignment of goals, get people bought in, understand their strengths, make sure they're with you before you try and run fast. Yeah, and critically, build that mutual trust. So that's all I was going to cover for today. I'm happy to take any questions from anyone.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anthony. I'll go to this microphone over there so you can stay where you are. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Anthony, for sharing your story. I think there are so many relevant messages that Anthony has given from his own experience for your business plan. Do you have a few questions? go through there's a particular theme that's come up in the questions around your growth strategy and the next steps for your company. Are you interested in stepping into new markets, particularly the Middle East, perhaps, or would you consider North Africa, or what does the next steps look like for your business?
Well, brilliant. So the geographic growth there you're talking about, which is one. But let me sort of step back a stage. So if I go back 3 or 4 years, we were still largely focused on selling the physical products, these remanufactured devices, right? And we realized, as I just mentioned a minute ago, that we were limited by the ambition of our supplier. So that's what got us thinking about all this stuff we'd learned over 15 years, is could we monetize that? Could we be consultants who advise other people how to do better? So that's when the thinking part of our business stepped in. So we moved from just doing the product to start doing the sort of consulting and the strategy and the advisory work. So that sort of change of services. But geographic's a great question. So we did. I mean, a lot of our growth journey has been starting in the UK, moving to Europe, moving to Asia, being told not to, but moving to America anyway and somehow managing it as a success. We have looked at Africa. It's quite a different market than Europe for a lot of reasons. So it's often about finding the right people and the right organizations to work with to get there. We typically have looked at Africa through the room of partnerships. So when you think about growth doesn't always have to be just what you do, it's what you can achieve through partners. So our next phase of growth is a lot around building partnerships, not for just geographic expansion, but to further expand the services that we offer.
Thanks, Anthony. We've probably got time for one more question. In fact, quite a few questions come up. Obviously, you're in the tech sector. How do you see AI impacting your business and how you do business? Yeah,
so the broader topic of digital sustainability, which is really my marketplace, covers not only how do we make IT more sustainable, but how does IT help the rest of society become sustainable. And I think AI is particularly useful in the latter, but it's probably causing some big challenges in the former, right? So AI is helping things become more efficient. You can use tools to really understand markets better, understand how products are put together better, design better solutions. But at the moment, because we're in this boom, we're actually consuming a lot of resources. We're consuming a lot of energy, a lot of water. You know, throw out some statistics. IT today is responsible for about 4% of global emissions. But with AI and all the other growth we see, it looks like it's going to be about 14% of global emissions by 2040. And that will make IT, including AI, the fastest growing emission stream. So whilst we're supposed to be trying to get off peak carbon and have halved our carbon by 2035, the current trends are showing us continue to accelerate away because of AI. So I think it's a balancing act there. At the moment, it's causing more impact than it's solving problems for. The hope is that it will continue to make everything we do more efficient. Power systems, the way we consume all sorts of products and services, and it will get us to a point where it's at least equal, but it's not there today.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I think we'll wrap it up there because I'm conscious that people will have another session to go to in a couple of minutes. But I just want to say, Anthony, a huge thank you for taking the time to come up from London today and spend your time sharing your insights with our students. I think you'll all agree that it's far more interesting to hear somebody who's living and breathing entrepreneurship for real than it is talking and looking at textbooks and so on. So let's give Anthony a round of applause and appreciation.